Let's talk about ethics and research. Specifically, let's talk about institutional review boards, known as IRBs, and the certification for protecting human participants. Um, Now, first of all, I want to say I'm a Christian, and that means I'm trying to follow Jesus and do what he wants me to do, and that means living up to the highest ethical standards and not hurting anybody to the degree that is possible, doing everything I can to do good to people and not do evil. And so that's basically what ethics is about. Um, Not everybody has a super strong commitment to doing good and not hurting people, and that's why the government has become involved and has created uh, uh, different regulations to try to ensure a greater likelihood of people acting ethically when they do researchers. And so that means even if we're personally committed to the highest ethical standards, we still need to follow government regulations and we need to become certified in protecting people when they participate in research. And we might actually learn a few things along the way about things that we hadn't thought about. Now, I want to talk about some key concepts. You either will go through or have gone through an online training course for protecting human participants. And this online course in the United States is required for everybody who is associated with an institution, an organization, or a school that receives funds from the National Institutes of Health. What are the National Institutes of Health? That's a government set of organizations, a set of institutes of health that receive and distribute research money if with health related topics. The government spends lots and lots of money on research, and the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, is in charge of distributing it. Sometimes they do their own research, um, but anybody who receives money from the NIH, which includes almost all universities and definitely includes Azusa Pacific University, um, the if you do research at one of these organizations that receives money, you have to go through this government mandated training program. Now, one of the ways that we protect people's rights is through informed consent. Informed consent means that people are warned of the dangers of the research that they're going to be participating in, and that they can withdraw. They have the right to withdraw from the research anytime that they want to. Now, in organizational psychology, we generally don't do anything that's dangerous. We give people surveys. It's a real safe way of doing things and we keep them anonymous. But if we were testing vaccines, there's always a possibility that a new vaccine might have negative consequences. And so we would have to warn people that there might be negative consequences if they want to get into a testing program for a vaccine. So the informed consent is really important when the research could actually be dangerous. It might be a little less important for participating in organizational psychology. But basically, informed consent is not like the little fine print that you click on when you use some software where you abandon your rights. The informed consents list what your rights are and how basically you don't have to do this if you don't want to. But it comes across as just a bunch of gobbledygook for most people, and they just click right through it. Um, at Azusa Pacific, we have a standard form of informed consent. And here's the type of informed consent for electronic surveys that we have. We've got a boilerplate. It's a basic form that everybody uses, and you just fill in a few blanks, like the time range that it takes to do the survey, and we give a brief explanation of the study. We don't give so much information that people can figure out what we're studying because uh, that creates a phenomenon known as demand characteristics. If people know what we're looking for, people that like us will give responses they'll be influenced, they'll be biased to give the responses that we like, and people who don't like us will be biased to give us um, uh, responses that will disprove or will provide evidence against our hypothesis. So we've got to be careful of demand characteristics. We don't want we don't want to influence people's responses. So we shouldn't give a real detailed explanation of what's going on. We want to give a brief explanation of the study, for example, to understand how people feel about their work situations. That tells them it's going to be about their work situation, but it doesn't let them know what our hypotheses are so that they can adjust their answers, even unconsciously. And so we tell what the possible risks are. There aren't any risks greater than what they would normally encounter in life. We're going to do everything we can to keep this confidential. We're not going to ask for any identifying information. And we ask for their consent. And rather than asking them to sign saying that they're willing to participate in the study, we ask them to click next at the bottom of the page to go on to the next page where the actual items and questions begin. And by clicking next, they give their consent to participate in the study. So that's the type of informed consent that we will use for electronic surveys in organizational contexts. All right, so some other key ideas is deception. I personally stay away from deceiving participants in every in any possible way, because I think it's really wrong and you can do damage to people. But the government regulations say that you can use deception, like you can give people false information, like in the Stanley Milgram experiment where they thought that they were giving people shots, but they weren't shocks, but they weren't really. If the benefit that comes from what we would learn if people are deceived is greater than the suffering that they'll go through knowing that they're deceived. But I personally, I would never want to use deception in my studies. I've put down key concept, government regulations, because it's interesting. Government regulations need to be really precise, and they need to take into consideration everybody's political concerns. And so they tend to become very, very complex. And a lot of the government regulated training almost seems like it's more about the government regulations than actually how to behave ethically. But you need to focus on what's important, and that is the principles that help people become that protect people. One idea is that we especially need to protect vulnerable population. That includes the unborn, children, people under 18, the mentally disabled, prisoners, anybody who's doesn't have the full ability to give their informed consent to participate. And if you study vulnerable populations, which we generally don't in organizational psychology, because people that work in organizations generally aren't parts of vulnerable populations, there has to be greater scrutiny given to this study. Now, when the Institutional Review Board looks at a study, they give approval for various types of studies. And these various types of studies are pretty confusing because the three of them start with E. And in fact, they start with EX. And they all sound alike. And then excluded and exempt, it's like they're almost using synonyms for two different classes of research. This is like government regulations gone wild. This is not an easy to sort out classification. But the lowest level of approval needed is what's known as excluded classroom research. And that's typically what's involved in research methods classes. It's low risk research done in classes, such as research methods, with non-vulnerable populations that will not be published or presented publicly. So if you're not going to publish the results and you have non-vulnerable populations and it's done in a classroom context, you don't need to fill out an IRB application. The professor can approve it without any forms. The next level is exempt research, and this includes people's theses. This is either low-risk research, meaning that nobody's going to get hurt, done on non-vulnerable populations that will be used in a public presentation or publication. So if you're either working with non-vulnerable populations, or it's going to be low-risk research that's going to be used in a public presentation, you need to have exempt research. And that's what a master's thesis is low-work research that will result in a publication, because you'll publish it online. That's usually a requirement for theses, so that it can be found in Google Scholar. Or it can be, the exempt research can be low-risk research done with vulnerable populations when the researchers have no interaction with members of the vulnerable population. For example, if you've got previous data collected on children, you're not going to hurt the children by using previous data collected on them if it's anonymous. So an IRB application is needed, which is typically a many-page application, and but the IRB will look at it and will take 1 to 2 to 3 weeks to decide that it's exempt, that they don't need to review it. The next highest level is the expedited review, and these are low-risk studies with vulnerable populations or non-anonymous data. These, the IRB have to give a more complete review, and it takes even longer. And then a full review are studies that are not low risk, that things can actually go wrong, and the IRB is going to make sure that you're doing everything possible so that nothing goes wrong and people don't get hurt. And these are very slow and can take 1 to 2 months for approval. Now, one of the things that you'll have to do, even for excluded classroom research, is your certification in human subjects. And if typically it's a 2-hour online course that most universities go through cityprogram.org, but other various universities will have different trainings, and it will meet the government requirements for being ethically trained. And so in research method, this course needs to be completed early in the semester before you begin collecting data.